to go. We're live on YouTube for anyone who wants to share it, who's not signed up.
Perfect. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. It's lovely to see some familiar faces there. Here's Livio. Yeah, I'm still enjoying my lockdown haircut, Livio, as you can see. So hopefully you guys all know by now about the website, which is www.authorhub.xyz, where we provide free interactive orthopedic education for all. We're adding quite a lot of new content all the time. And we're also all across social media platforms. So please do follow us at Orthohub XYZ and subscribe to the YouTube channel. We have lots of new video content coming very soon. We've been recording quite a bit. So it's exciting times, lots of new things happening. Now, I just had to share that with you guys because I love that so much. I keep watching it again and again. It gives me tingles. We've got the C1Do1 podcast, which is on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, every other podcast platform. So please do subscribe and please leave us some ratings. We've not had any yet. The latest episode came out yesterday and that's been quite exciting. I did it with Primachan, a colleague of mine, and it's about choosing a mentor and choosing a fellowship. And we cover quite a lot of useful stuff. And it's interesting. A lot of the feedback has been, this is stuff I wish I knew before. This is stuff people don't really talk about in public. So it's good fun. And I hope you like it. And if there's anything that you guys want us to cover in future podcasts, please tweet me at Cash Akhtar, and I'll be very happy to take requests. Just before we start, I want to bring your attention to our next webinar in a fortnight, which will bring you in conjunction with our friends and colleagues at OR UK, which is basically how to improve your total knee replacement outcomes. We've got some fantastic speakers, and they're going to explain the basic science of knee replacement for the FRCS Orth and for life, and then how to apply these clinically with practical tips so you get perfect knee replacements every time. Results may vary. I guarantee that every single person will learn at least one thing that will change their practice forever. So don't miss it. But now for something completely different, something I'm super excited about. How to thrive in diversity, resources for the orthopedic surgeon is what we called it. But actually, I'm confident there's going to be something here for everyone from all walks of life. Our panel tonight aims to offer you some practical and emotional help, support, and encouragement. We've got a fantastic panel, and they're going to introduce themselves, so I'll get out of the way. Please be open, please be curious, ask questions via the Q&A, and please get involved. Over to you, Homa.
Thanks very much, Cash. And I'm Homa Arshad. I'm an orthopedic consultant. My clinical practice is hip and knee arthroplasty and pelvic and acetabular trauma. And I'm very excited to be here to talk about well-being from the perspective of our experience as an orthopedic department. At the beginning of this crisis, I became a well-being lead, and as of last week, I took on the role of clinical lead at the Royal London Hospital. So I hope that we will be able to share some common experiences and things that have worked well for us and how we face certain challenges. And very excited to be here with my colleague Esther. I need to unmute her, I think.
Ooh. There you go. So I made the mute mistake. Hi, my name's Esther Murray. Oh no, I should be unmuted. My name's Esther Murray. I clearly can't work with technology. I'm a health psychologist and I work at Barts and the London School of Medicine and Dentistry, and I do lots of bits and pieces about the well-being of healthcare professionals and the research in the area of moral injury. And I am thrilled to be here with my colleague Sarah Swanton.
Thanks very much, Esther. And hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Swanton, and I am a wellbeing and resilience coach. And I work with leaders, business leaders and their teams in organizations, and really teach them how to operate or navigate their day from a place of calm, common sense, clarity. And what that means is that they are able to make much smarter decisions, create more impact within the organization and within their team, and ultimately get better results. And all of that without the burnout, the unnecessary burnout and the stress as well. So that's me. And yeah, really delighted to be here this evening and share something of what I've seen to work in and around wellbeing. So thanks for having me.
Brilliant. There's, I wanted to talk about how there's a perception that with the COVID crisis, there's a perception that as orthopedic surgeons, we haven't been affected much, and that we haven't been, on the front line of dealing with the main brunt of it. But actually, of course, we've been affected. Of course, everybody has, and in our roles, everything changed for us almost overnight. And that's been, very clear in every setting, including for us as orthopedic surgeons. And also, there's a stereotype that we have of being very strong and simple types. And actually, we are complex human beings with needs and strengths. And a particular insight that was quite helpful before all of this started is, as part of our consultant development program, we undertook a Strengths Finder workshop where we answered a whole series of questions, and it really shed a light on the way we function best. And really interesting to see that we as a department are extremely diverse. There's every ethnicity, every gender, every background. When you talk to people in the department, you get a whole range of perspectives. But in terms of our functioning, there are certain characteristics that that are very strong in the group, almost universally found. We are people who function well when there's structure, when we know what we're dealing with, when you give us a problem, we want to solve it. And so being thrown into a crisis where there was a lot of uncertainty and an urgency of needing to engage with something that we didn't, that was unprecedented. That was particularly challenging for us as a group, and I think that's probably the case for many orthopedic surgeons in many departments. Esther, you've got some thoughts on what might be particularly challenging for us as a group?
Yeah, I think so. Human minds don't really like dealing with uncertainty at all. Okay, and we always joke, don't we, about how certain groups of people in medicine, and I suppose we joke about it in medicine because that's what we know really well. So certain groups in medicine, they perform like types, and we're a bit perhaps not terribly kind to each other about it. But the point is, we all have preferences, like all humans have a certain set of preferences for the way they do things. And when the pandemic came along, that completely challenged all the preferences that you folk had, that being able to solve a problem, well, here's a problem you can't solve. It's not even in your area that you could have perhaps solved or dealt with part of it. There was lots you then couldn't achieve. All your plans for what you would have achieved, all the surgeries that you had booked up and organised and things that you had thought about were thrown out of the window. So that was out of it as well. And working within a structure, well, you're working within a structure, but that structure was changing all the time. The guidance was changing all the time. People were being redeployed. All the systems and ways of doing things had changed. So it's really, really particularly unsettling for those reasons.
Yeah, and so what was helpful, so quite early on, we realized there were certain things that that needed our attention and that we needed to have consensus on. And so one of the things we decided quite early on was to enable our feeling of safety at work. We would explore the evidence around the practicality and the whole way we wanted to engage with the use of PPE. And so, and that really brought us together as a department, gave us a task to do, helped us move forwards. And there were certain projects that we took on at that time, which were really useful to us as a department and to us in terms of our ability to keep functioning. So that was quite helpful. And one concept that we come across with well-being is radical acceptance. It's very tiring arguing with reality. And there are certain things that we don't want to be true and that we need to resolve and explore and analyze, but later. And at the time, we need to get our heads down and get on with it. So I think that's one thing that was helpful. And then the well-being provision in the trust was quite was pretty complete. There were people we could call on. There was a telephone number. We could call up a psychologist if we needed help. But it felt as if we would have to be in a pretty extreme place to reach out in that way. And I felt that there was a need for us to look out for each other. And there was a lot of information about personal care and relaxation, but from talking to people, one thing that became clear quite early on is that when people felt unsettled, a large context of that was the workplace. And being in a leadership position it just seemed essential to being in a position to make changes to people in a way that was meaningful to their experience at work, would change their whole outlook, would change their, have a big impact on their ability to feel centered and to function. And there's also the experience of feeling that it's all dreadful. I think that's been quite a common theme as well. And one that it's important to acknowledge that for some people it's just felt dreadful at times. Probably for many people it's just felt dreadful at times. And that's okay. That's okay. That's something that it's really important to accept. Esther's had some really useful things to say about the fact that it can all just feel that work is not what you expected, the loss of role, the loss of, particularly as surgeons, the loss of that enjoyment of flow. That's something that Jesus says people in our team have had their ups and downs at different times. Yeah, that's quite a common theme. I think Esther is muted still though.
No, I'm off my mute button. I'm just being polite. I was being polite, Homa. That's why you didn't recognize what that behavior was. I wanted to speak to something you said earlier on. You said we had the number of a psychologist, but you'd have to be in a pretty bad state to phone a psychologist. And I think that's a really common perception. You really don't, yeah. But it feels like if I phone this person, that's really an admission that all is not well. And that's the hardest thing, isn't it? It's one thing to say inside yourself, oof, I'm not quite okay. Or maybe to say to someone that you know and trust, oof, I'm not quite okay. But it's quite something to phone a complete stranger and say, I'm not all right. So, and I think that's been not just with you folk at all. That's happened in other places as well, that the psychologists are sitting there waiting for the phone to ring because nobody feels quite poorly enough or quite upset enough. So I felt like I needed to address that.
So if I may, Sue Deakin said, absolutely, people in her team have had their ups and downs at different times. And Tony Clayson is asking, did any of the orthopaedic colleagues recognize they needed support, and did they seek it? And how did you approach situations where colleagues were reluctant to seek advice? Or how would you suggest people go about it, Esther? If you're in a situation where you think a colleague may need help, but they're not asking for help, how do you go about addressing that?
Yeah, so that's really one of the most delicate things, and that question comes up all the time because it's the thing we're the most frightened of, is really offending somebody by saying, I think you're not quite yourself. So it's really worth acknowledging that if you do get to a point where you say that to somebody, you kind of say, oh, you're right, we all say that, and then they say yes because that's what you say, and then you really need to ask again, are you really, how are you really, something like that. And it's really possible that somebody will tell you to get lost. That is really possible. And so we have to know that might happen and be sort of all right with it. And they might be really grateful that you've spotted it and that you've said something, because it's we all know how much courage it takes to approach someone in that way, don't we? But just be mindful, it could go either way. And sometimes, like change doesn't happen it's not like the movies, is it? So you might be saying to somebody, you sure you're all right? I'm not really convinced, and then they kind of tell you to go away or whatever, and then later when they're by themselves or maybe something else happens and then they think, actually, I do need to do something about this, we really do need to manage our own expectations though when we're trying to get other people to seek help. It's not a simple thing.
Sarah, I just wonder if you had any thoughts, because obviously you're used to dealing with high functioning individuals, and some people are quite possibly on the spectrum, as a lot of surgeons can be. I wonder if you had any tips for managing people who perhaps need help and won't seek it.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? And of course, nobody likes to be told what to do. No, I mean that's the quickest way to get someone to tell you to just bugger off. But I think, in my experience, when I work with leaders, the best way to show someone else or to inspire somebody else, because let's face it, people make changes for one of two reasons. They're either inspired or they're desperate. And you'd hope it be the inspired. And if you're a leader, one of the best ways to inspire other people to, get some help, or it's not even get some help, but just even look at themselves, how am I actually doing here? Am I all right? Or how am I feeling about all of this? Is to make the changes yourself initially and have some kind of strategies. And it doesn't have to be anything complex. It could just be one or two really basic things that you're doing that is making a difference. And eventually, if you've got a fairly good relationship with them, in a casual kind of way, they may say, what are you doing differently? And that's when the door is open to have a chat. But yeah, it's a difficult one, because you don't want to tell someone what to do, or you wait until they're desperate and then the door opens in that way. So
it's funny you say that, because almost every conversation I have with Homa has been, how are you? I go, yeah, I'm all right. And then she always follows up with, how are you really? And then that's where okay, now I'll tell you, I'm annoyed I can't operate.
It's become a thing. It's become a thing in our department that sort of almost, it's just, we're all very relaxed with each other, I think. And how are you is just a sort of social nicety that doesn't extract anything from, except for, as you say, Esther, a like social response. And so we've gone to saying, how are you really? Even as the first greeting, how are you really? And so one thing I started doing quite early on is the 5-minute check-in with your team, which goes, how are you really? What are you worried or fearful about? What's been good? And what do you need? And it just, in 5 minutes, you can get so much information about what people, how people can be helped. Obviously paying attention to the boundaries that are necessary with that kind of conversation, as you said, Esther. That's been really useful, but it's not in a large department, it's not a job for one person. And it's as with everything else we do, you need a group of people who have the interests and have the role to make sure everyone is everyone, there's eyes on everyone. And one pitfall is asking for volunteers with that task, because the people who volunteer to lead groups or lead small groups aren't necessarily the people who would have those conversations, or who would naturally have those conversations. So it's much more about looking out for who are the people who are going to help bring the group together and keep the group engaged in a way that's healthy.
Well, there's a question
Sarah,
coming for you.
Sorry?
After you. There's a question that's coming for you, which says, how did you find your colleagues responded to you being chosen as a wellbeing lead? Because Tony Clayson found that his orthopaedic colleagues were surprised that he wanted to take on a role like that.
Well, I have to tell Tony, it's great to have you here. And there wasn't a role. I said, this is what I'm going to do, because right at the beginning, I felt I wasn't sure if we were going to see lots of dead bodies piled up in the corridors, and I didn't feel ready for that. And I spoke with Taff Edwards, my military colleague, who explained some really useful strategies, particularly experiential exchange. So if we are witnessing things that are unsettling and we're not accustomed to them, which can happen in the course of our work anyway, the best thing you can do is if you feel like it, speaking to a colleague about it afterwards, before you go home. And actually with lockdown and the pubs being shut, there was a danger that that wouldn't happen. And that would leave people vulnerable to long-standing psychological trauma. So there were some ideas that I found really useful, and nobody else wanted to take that on. And so I said, this is my job. This is my job. I was going to do it. And I guess people might say, well, why would you do it? It's there's a well-being part of the trust that as a consultant you're not asked to do it. It's not, doesn't feature in your job description, but I think it's part of being a good leader. I wondered, Sarah, if you would talk about your well-being audit as a really useful. I think it's a really useful tool for, as you said earlier, looking at what's going on for yourself and changes that you might be able to make.
Yeah, I'd love to. And what I'm going to actually do is share my screen so that for those of you who may not have seen this yet, can you all see that? Yeah, good. So this is on my screen, but you can also access this on the OrthoHub website. And maybe Cash might pop a link to that later as well. But it's very easy to find on the OrthoHub website. And what this is it's a bit like, I call it a human MOT, if you like. And what it is it's a way of, see, one of the things about human beings is we, on the surface, we all look very, very different, but actually underneath it all, we all work one way. And this explains, well, what is it that makes a human being operate in this world, navigate through life in a way that is satisfying, fulfilling, able to deal with challenges and problems in a way that it doesn't floor them, you know, so they're able to navigate the ebb and flow and generally feel like they are winning at the game of life, if you like. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Ivan Tyrrell and Joe Griffin, and what they put together was what they call the human givens approach. And this is based on that. And it's based on the idea that all of us as human beings have a set of primal human needs that when they're all met in healthy and appropriate ways, and I really emphasize healthy and appropriate ways, and I'll explain a bit about how that cannot be the case, then it means that we are functioning well. We've got spare capacity to deal with whatever's coming our way. And like I said, we're not floored by challenges. And it's when one or more of these needs are not being met, or they're not being met in healthy and appropriate ways, that's when we begin to suffer or struggle. That's when we begin to feel stressed or overwhelmed, or, you know, that feeling of, I just can't deal with this today. Not, you know, I haven't got the bandwidth to do it. So what this is there's 9 altogether, and you would go through and score where you are. And ideally you're looking for around 7 out of 10. I mean, nobody is perfect. I don't think I've ever seen anybody score 10 out of 10. And anything less than 7, you might want to have a little look at and think, well, you know, how could I nudge that up a bit? And this is designed, I'm certainly not interested in things that put lots of, you know, that gives people more to do. I want to take things off people's to-do lists. And this is really simple. And I think we were talking about this, Esther, on a call leading up to this, is that sometimes it doesn't need to be something massive to make a big difference. And what this is about. So the need to give and receive attention fulfilled through friends, family, colleagues, pets, acquaintances. And what Homa was talking about with the 5-minute check-in, the 4 questions, I thought that was really interesting, because you just came up with that. But interestingly, it really ticks that box so nicely, that to know that you can walk into work and you will be asked that question. The first few times it might be, yeah, I'm fine, thank you. But if you know you're going to be asked that, it may be, okay, I am going to give you a bit of a preview about what's going on for me. And I can imagine all of you give people a lot of attention, but perhaps don't always get the attention back sometimes. So it's important to have, you know, as much as you give out, you also get it back as well. And then it can be outside of work as well. So even just a simple thing like at home here, for example, we don't have devices at the table, and we ask each other, how was your day today? And, or tell me one good thing about your day. And it's amazing just how nice that feels, just to be asked and you know, eyeball each other. Then I'll just whiz through these quickly. I won't, because they are, as I said, on the website, but the need to look after mind and body, sleep, rest, exercise, diet, fresh air. I mean, that's kind of obvious and we all know that. But what's really interesting about human beings is we're designed to know that, and we're designed, whether we listen to it is another thing, but we always get that little nudge, and it might be a little whisper. So maybe you come home from work and it's late and your head's full, and it's like, do I have a glass of wine or do I go to bed? And you kind of know you know that actually going to bed would be a good idea. And you're sort of, it's like your inner compass is letting you know what the right thing is to do. And the only thing that gets in the way is just thought, you know, oh no, you know, but the internal guidance is letting you know what to do to look after you. And that takes practice sometimes, and we're so used to just pressing snooze or override on exercise and, you know, eating the right things. But actually, when you listen to the whisper underneath the big brass band, it is letting you know what to do next. And this is what was interesting when I was, you know, hearing you talk about PPE, because there's need for sense of, you know, a sense of safety and security, particularly in your workplace. And what struck me is how obviously there was a threat to your safety, and you all got together and asked yourselves the question, well, how are we going to stay safe? And you obviously went through a process of looking at the evidence and looking what the processes were and what you needed to do, and that was your priority. So, and the ones that have scored so far, it looks like you've scored quite high, which was pleasantly, you know, surprising and refreshingly good to see. Sense of community and making a contribution, fulfilled through belonging to a community, association, club, a group of like-minded friends, and so on. Well, this that you guys have created here is a community. You're like-minded, you can get together. It's work, but it's not work as well, because it's outside of your working hours, and it's a place where you can connect and share ideas. So you're meeting that need wonderfully just through this. So it's great. The need for challenge and creativity. Well, pushing yourself out your comfort zone, I think you can all tick quite high on that. But having fun is in there as well. And Esther, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that part, the having fun, because it doesn't always feel like, when big serious things are going on, it often feels like we should be serious to go with it. And I don't know what you thought about that as well.
Yeah, so we have a sort of a funny, like our little inner critic or our inner judge tells us, so there's an appropriate way to behave in this situation, and this is an appropriate way to behave. But actually, of course, all our emotions are available to us all the time if we let them be. There's nothing wrong with finding the good. It came up actually in the chat. I've been watching the chat roll up as we've been talking as well, and somebody said lots of positives have come out of it, and of course they have, of course they have. And of course there have been times when you've laughed and you've felt relieved, or you felt good, or you've enjoyed what's happening and you felt proud, like Homa was talking about, investigating all the appropriate PPE and all that kind of thing that needed to happen. So happiness and humor and joy are all part of it too. And Homa mentioned earlier this thing about flow, talking about the regret of not being able to do the job that you usually do, you know, if you've been redeployed or if surgeries have been postponed or whatever. Because you're really good at it. When you're good at something, it brings you such pleasure to do it, and that is right and proper. And so of course you miss it when you can't do it, and it's really important to acknowledge that. It's important to acknowledge what's hard and what you miss. Will that do?
Yeah, that's great. Sarah, a question's come in, which is, do you mind just, as you're carrying on, just to discuss where people often score low on this and how they might go about changing that?
Yeah. The control thing comes up, but actually it's easier to, like, this is an interesting one. So I'll use this situation as an example. So COVID comes along, no one really predicted it, or maybe a few did, but they weren't listened to, and literally the whole globe feels like they're out of control. People are stressing out all over the place and thinking that they don't have, that it's not gonna be like this forever. It's gonna be permanent. It's gonna affect their entire life. And so no wonder what that feeling of not having control can do, can just send people into a worry cycle. And that is when we go downhill quite quickly, because we start imagining the future, even though it hasn't happened yet. And because we're feeling our thinking, we are literally experiencing, you know, for me, for example, I lost the plot for about 3 days because we lost all of our business, all of our pipeline. In 3 days, it was just wiped out. And this was in March, and my head went to June immediately. And I was in June thinking we were bankrupt. And of course that hadn't happened, but I was suffering in that way. And so if you'd asked me in that moment, I would have said, I'm about a 2 out of 10. But actually, when my mind settled, I knew what to do. And that was to, right, how much money have we got? What business could we potentially still salvage? And there was a plan in place. And even though there's less money in the bank account today than there was in March, I am 7, 8 out of 10 because I have a plan. And that's the point, is that your life doesn't have to be looking perfect, but you do. The need for a sense of control is that you have a plan in place when things are feeling out of control. Does that make sense?
I love your analogy about the snow globe, Sarah. When things are unsettled, it's like shaking the snow globe and you can't see clearly. It's really difficult to think clearly. Yeah. And somehow, by getting the calm back, somehow it allows things to settle. Yeah.
Yeah, the snow globe is a really good example, because we think when our heads fill up, we think we need to think our way out of it. And we either forget or we don't know that by trying to think our way out of it, our head fills up even more and we can't see clearly. And you know that feeling, don't you? We probably can all think of a time, maybe in the last few weeks, where something has just been, you can't make a decision about something, or something is, you're negatively ruminating about something. And then eventually you just go, forget it, I'm going to bed. And you wake up in the morning and boom, there's clarity. And that's because the snow globe has been set down and it's been able to settle. And when we settle, that's when we get our best ideas. So yeah, it's a good one.
And it really struck a chord with, I think it will do with lots of people, what you said about the big brass band. And what Esther said about how much we love our jobs and how much we love operating, and we sign up to something that's the big brass band, and it's easy to neglect everything else that we need when a part of life is so good.
Can I ask a question about, to do with the framework? Phil Matthew wants to know, is there a possibility that you stop to do the analysis and you score low and you end up in a downward cycle and you can kind of become indifferent towards it? and you know, his concern is people could lose motivation. And so we're offering the framework out, and I guess how do people then implement that if they find that they are struggling in certain criteria?
Yeah, that's a real possibility, isn't it? You look at it and you just feel disheartened and discouraged and think, well, what's the point? You know, there's so much to do, and half of that is when you're in that place, everything is black and white anyway, so it's difficult to be able to see the hope, you know. And I would say if anyone is scoring that, then just reach out to someone that you do feel you can trust, and who you feel isn't judgmental and is literally there as your sounding block, and someone who can just, it could be a coach, but it doesn't have to be at all. It could be a partner or someone, like I said, that you trust, and just say, right, this is all looking a bit hopeless at the moment. I want the fact that you did the framework in the first place, and you sat down to tick it. There's a part of you that has a vested interest in your own well-being. So that's the part to work with. And the fact is, you know, what is it about it that stops it being a 0 all the way down all across the board? There's something working in the right direction. So I think a lot of why we get ourselves caught up is because our expectations are different from reality. And actually, sometimes just saying, you know, I mean, that day when everything looked hopeless, when all the business was cancelled, it didn't immediately occur to me to put a plan in place, and it did look awful. But then I'm reminded, and you probably have examples yourself, where something that looks awful at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday looks completely different at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday. And that's because the nature of our thought is always moving moment to moment. So don't always trust a snapshot as well, of what looks like 2 across the board, because actually, you know, in a different moment, it can look a bit not so bad. If that helps. That's
so true. And in terms of tuning into what our needs are and how we feel about a certain situation, Esther was talking about the experience of anger, which is something we all experience, and how that feels different to different people.
So shall we do this? Right. So I learned a nifty trick in Hawaii, happily, at a conference. So not everybody knows what they're feeling all the time. So I was interested to see the discussion just before about, like, what if you score yourself a 2 on some of those, some of the things on the human givens, and then you feel really sad. Actually, if you know that you feel sad, that's incredibly useful. And if you know in what kind of realm of your experience you feel sad, that's really useful information. And allowing yourself to feel your feelings is a really important thing. But we often don't like to feel them. We certainly don't like to admit to feeling them because we're a bit embarrassed. We talked about it earlier on about whether joy was appropriate or inappropriate. Right, so we picked anger because most of us feel mostly all right with anger. There are lots of feelings you can do this exercise with, but let's start off with one that we're a little bit familiar with. And I want you to do something, and I want you to do this on the chat. I think is probably the best place to do it. So there's 2 things to do, so don't do it until I've told you both the things. So everybody has a phrase or a word or a set of words that they say when they're cross, okay? Or they think these things. Maybe they don't feel they can say them out loud, but this phrase comes up in their head. And swearing, I believe, is allowed. We're not after the watershed, but it's all grown up, so you are allowed to swear, so don't feel bad. So I want you to think, just take a minute, don't type anything yet, but think of what it is that you either say to yourself in your head, maybe about other people, maybe about yourself, or what you say out loud when you're angry. And when you've got that, I want you to mark on a scale of 1 to 10. I want you to give yourself a score. So how angry do you have to be? Where 10 is incandescent with rage, you're nearly levitating off the ground, you're so furious, and 0 is you're not cross at all. So think of your phrase You're not allowed to dob in your wife, Mike. Think of a phrase and think of how cross on a scale of 1 to 10. How angry do I have to be to say this thing? And now you can put them in the chat. And we're going to watch them come up. Lovely. Thank you, Cash.
I suppose, Esther, everyone has a different threshold for when they would explode or have to let it all out.
So if we can see, so what we can see on the chat rolling in, well done everybody, lovely swearing. So we usually do this in person, and you should see how much people laugh when they see how much other people curse. Exactly. So some people will get as far as effing and blinding at about a 3 or a 4. So other people will be so horrified and can't get to a bloody hell until they're at a 10. All right. So we do, can you see, this is so fun to see this come in. So
Verona, that's very civilized.
Different thresholds of our anger, and it's a little bit hard to use our own measures to predict what someone else is feeling. Okay, so you might think because somebody's effing and blinding, well, that just means they're nearly, you know, apoplectic with rage, but actually for them, they're just mildly annoyed. And you might think somebody says bloody hell and that they're mildly annoyed, but actually that's them nearly off the scale with fury. The most important thing you can know is what it means to you, what you feel like, okay, when you're angry. And you might notice, so we often do this thing, it's a really human thing to do. We attribute lots of feelings and motivations to other people that have nothing to do with them, and they are everything to do with us. So being able to reflect on what our feelings are like, what they're qualitatively like by putting the words to them, and how angry we have to be, for example, in order to express them, we start to see that there's quite a lot of nuance in all of this. And then we look at this on the chat here and we realize what's happening to one person isn't what's happening to another. And it reminds us also to be mindful when we're imposing motivations or ways of going on to other people, we might not be right about it. The other thing, of course, it's what useful for in teams. If we ever have the chance to get together and do this kind of thing again, it's really useful for a team to know this about one another, because it helps us remember that some people's explosive anger is really upsetting for other people, because that's not how they do anger at all. So there's a lot you can do with this, but I will stop for now. But thank you. I can see all the swears coming up. Well done. So in touch with your feelings. So in touch.
The other thing, as you say, is that some
true
people
how
actually
can feel really wounded by other people's anger, especially if it feels like it's directed at them, where there's no intention to wound or harm. It's just someone's way of being. But I suppose in the workplace we have to be mindful that there are codes of conduct.
That's right. And also so as you say, it wasn't the intention, but you see what we can't predict. What we can't predict is how people are going to receive things. And we're a bit like jigsaw pieces, but we can't see each other's jigsaw piece. So sometimes we have what's called a pathological fit. So someone will be explosively angry and someone else is really likely to kind of receive that anger as something that belongs to them, even though it doesn't. And so these two jigsaw pieces fit together in a pathological fit. And that's not great, especially not at work. We don't want that. So that is why we try to keep a lid on our fury at work if we can.
Yeah.
The one thing I was going to say was that that's a real issue with WhatsApp, isn't it? People.
Yeah,
I think that's been the real problem with, you know, it can be at work WhatsApp groups, because people you don't know how the other person said it and what their intention was.
Yeah, and we get very disinhibited online as well. We say things that we wouldn't normally say.
Yeah. Tony, I'm just reminded by your comments and comments about Pete. You asked me at the beginning, how did people respond when I said I wanted to be wellbeing lead? And Pete's our clinical director, and he doesn't really take anything passively. So he was very, very positive about it and said, you can't do it just for us. You have to do it for the whole department. That means juniors, fellows, everyone. And so I took that quite seriously. And as a group, I think we've tried to be like an umbrella, extending particularly to our juniors who are redeployed, to support them, you know, for their ongoing needs at work in terms of wanting to do whatever they could to further their learning, and to show them the light at the end of the tunnel, and to be there for pastoral reasons and to support them when they were having issues. So that's been, yeah, WhatsApp can be dangerous. That's a really good idea, Sue, having a radio silence. I don't know if we would ever be able to enforce that, but I think it's a great idea. Yes, Cash.
There are two questions that come in from real extreme ends of the scale of experience. There was a trainee saying that they've basically been forced or bullied into doing lots of extra work and research into COVID to further a senior supervisor's kind of agenda. And then at the other end of the scale, the most senior end, you've got Primachan, who's saying, what about when people in senior leadership positions use the uncertainty of a crisis to push through their agendas? This is very common and far more unsettling than the crisis itself. And so there are times where people are pushing things through and impose themselves on other people, and that causes anger and frustration. And I'd be curious to hear if you guys have any tips on how people can go about coping with that and handling that situation.
Well, so you sort of answered that question for yourselves earlier on, because you were talking about getting into the habit of checking in with each other in a very specific way. So the more that becomes part of the culture of your departments or your teams, the more possibilities there are for people to be able to ask one another for help, so that when people feel they're being pressured, or when people are watching other people get all sharp elbows and pushing their own agenda, there's someone safe to talk to. So see, that's why we cultivate all that. It's like the base level stuff. The better the communication is between people most of the time, the better it will be when there's trouble. So Sue Deakin said at one point much earlier on, she said, isn't peer support really great before going to any experts like psychologists and stuff? And absolutely, all the research evidence bears out that peer support is one of the most important things we can do for one another. So setting up, well, not even setting up, just being able to have useful conversations with one another. And it's this, don't be afraid, you know, it's the same with these problems with the pushing of agendas or bullying type behaviors, and we're trying to get people to do stuff for us. It's the same sort of thing. When you have an open culture where people can speak to one another, that sort of stuff gets nipped in the bud much more quickly.
I agree 100%, Esther. And openness, honesty, and our strength comes as a group. And so I totally agree about peer support, and Sue's point about not needing an expert is spot on. But we've been using an expert, another psychologist in our group in the trust, not for support really. It's slightly different. We've been using her for reflective practice, which is something we should all do as surgeons. But we have small facilitated groups that seem to work together, groups of 3 or 4 orthopedic consultants, and it's a forum for talking about work in a way that's constructive, and we can express what we really want, what we really feel, with challenge from the other people in the group, and discussion and sharing of difficult feelings like missing the work and feeling worried about the future. And that way, I think we can be more honest about what we as a group really want, and present that in a united way. So that's been pretty useful. So there's some chat about anger at work. That's really struck a chord with some people, I think.
Can I say one more thing about anger? I am quite good. I'm a bit of an anger ninja. I really love being angry. It's my favorite thing to be, because it makes me feel really powerful and really in charge of the situation. So this is essentially what it's doing for us. That's why we like it. And I did do quite an extensive bit of stuff with regard to anger. So there's a note here on the chat about shouting at people when things go wrong. And then, of course, other people being really upset by that. If we get to know a bit better what anger does for us, so just do a bit of reflecting, like we did this kind of daft thing about the swearing earlier, but that kind of thing. There's another exercise you can do where you work out what it actually feels like. How do you feel? For some people, they feel terrible and they cry. And for some people, they feel fabulous. So knowing what it does for you does help you get a little bit in control of it. You can't really get to grips with anything unless you know what it is that you're looking at. And then, as with any behavior change, if being angry makes someone feel good, or it makes it feel like the thing is a bit better now because they've shouted or sworn or thrown a thing or whatever it is, that's really fine and really human, and might be a little bit of a difficult habit to give up because it's really, really satisfying. But acknowledging all of that, so that's a bit like we were talking about filling out the MOT thing, you know, acknowledging what is there gives you the opportunity of changing it. You can't change it until you acknowledge it. So these aren't shameful things to be hidden away, but they are behaviors that might make life at work a little bit difficult.
Yeah, but it can be useful.
Oh yeah.
I think, you know, a controlled emotion is very powerful. If people see that something matters to you, but you're in control of it, that can be quite effective.
Yeah,
What do you think?
I think it has a lot to do with how you express it, and just mindful that for some people in the room, that's going to feel really, really uncomfortable. So you're unlikely to have a group of people in the room who are shouters. You're going to have some people who are shouters, some people who are criers, some people who are massive internalizers trying to pretend it's not happening. And that's when the difficulty arises. But what about naming it? What about saying, I'm really angry? I'm so angry about this.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk a lot and not draw breath, you know. Yeah. It's all right.
And the other one on anger as well, it's so tempting, isn't it, to complain or moan about someone when you get home from work, or, you know, with a confidant, and just and completely just feel cross and angry, but it's directed at the wrong person. And that can just eat you up so much. So it's either, right, I'm wasting time here talking about this person when I could be, you know, having dinner and enjoying my time off at the moment. And I'm effectively, I'm still at work, but I'm at home. And I guess if you want a solution to that, it's either, well, I either let it go or park it until I know what to do about it, or I do something about it. But otherwise you can end up just, you know, being at work, but not being at work and not being paid for it. And it can just go on and on. So even just catching yourself, here I go again. And like Esther says, sometimes it's just a habit as well. And even after tonight, you may find like, oh, I'm doing that. And you would never have caught yourself before. Sometimes it's just letting something come up, you know, bubble up to the surface.
I want to reply to Phil. How do you get a group of orthopedic surgeons to discuss their feelings? So that's not what we call it. We call it reflective practice, and people don't talk about, they talk about things that matter to them. And, you know, emotion is part of the normal human experience of everything, including work. And I suppose what we've tried to do is set up groups of where people feel it's going to be useful and constructive, and so people choose who they want to work with, and we have quite small groups. So far there've been 6 groups, and there are more next week. The other thing to say is not everyone wants to use it. It's not a facility that's being forced on anyone, but the feedback we've had is that it's been really useful in terms of people just being able to discuss, having that protected time to discuss what matters with colleagues. That's all it is.
May I make a comment, Phil? For one thing that we started, and not for a second are we saying we're better than anyone else or we're experts at this, but we started a consultant development program, and we scheduled that for during the time of initially for one of our consultants meetings. That's really the strengths finder that Homa mentioned at the beginning. And what that really did was it let us all sit around and read each other what made us tick. I've got a colleague who asked what I think are the most irrelevant questions in the trauma meeting and drags things on. And it was funny when I got to see his strengths. It was that he was very meticulous and he needed all these bits of information to function and make a decision. And I promise you, the minute I heard that, I stopped for some muttering under my breath in the trauma meeting. I mean, it was never anything unpleasant. But I was just like, I really get it now. I'm like, let him ask all the questions he wants. I get it. That's what he needs. And I think that setting up a strengths finder, it's a Clifton strengths finder. It's kind of the Myers-Briggs, but much more valuable and positive. Just having that during a consultant meeting where everyone's going to be there anyway, find is that opens up a dialogue. It gets people talking. It gets people used to talking about these things. Now, we're not sitting around hugging each other and doing group hugs and things, but the fact is, it's allowed us to get to a place where then Homa's come as a wellbeing lead and instigate all these debrief and all these things with, and that's made a huge difference.
So I'm aware of time. I could sit and talk with Esther and Sarah for another hour easily, but we've tried to keep this to a focused time, which is an hour. Are there any particular questions? I think we've been dealing with questions as we've gone along. Cash might have to help us out here.
The only really the one question that is a key question from Neil Kang in Cambridge, that different personalities behave differently under stress and require different coping strategies. Given that we're diverse, how do we as individuals help our colleagues if we're not specialists in the field?
I think you've sort of already answered that partly yourselves, but because you don't have to be specialists, you just do have to know each other a little bit. And sometimes some of the questionnaires are really useful for that, like the strengths finder and thing, because we all have styles and preferences, and maybe we know that and maybe we don't. Maybe we do need to fill a questionnaire in or do an exercise to know that. You just don't have to be an expert. You do have to let people be who they are a bit and have their thing, like the person who's really meticulous and that's just the way they are, but it's still going to drive you a bit around the bend when they do that in a meeting if you feel really under pressure of time, but you at least know kind of where it comes from. And the same with the needs that people have. They have to know themselves. That's the only thing. We don't always know what we need. That's a bit of a drama. So sometimes that's where it's helpful to have someone asking the questions, even if it's another team member. I hope that makes sense.
I completely agree, Esther. The number of times a colleague has phoned me on, some other reason, but then the conversation goes on quite quickly to actually unhappiness and feeling of stress. And they're telling me what they need. And I feel like I just have to say, well, I think you should pick up the phone and speak to your friend because I'm your colleague and we don't really have that relationship, but I know who your friend is. For example, the person, if they know their own needs, which they often do, far better than I would. They know it's just a matter of a little bit of direction sometimes.
Or permission. Sometimes people need permission.
Yeah. Great. Sarah, can you tell us about your podcast?
Oh yes, just very quickly. It's so there's one up at the moment, which I'm just in the process of moving over. So it was Happy Healthy Minds before, and I'm in the process of switching it over to the Mindful Leadership podcast, and it may be of use to some of you. It is nothing to do with meditation or anything like that. It's more, when I talk about mindful, it's more about noticing, well, what happens when I do this? That works and that doesn't. So it's really leading through. The main premise of where I'm coming from is, how do we help leaders to lead with less on their mind most of the time? I don't want to say all of the time, but less on their mind most of the time. And what happens, and what tends to happen when people lead with less on their mind is they come up with better ideas. They're able to make smarter decisions. They're able to create so much more impact and connect better with not just their team, but others around them as well. So the first one drops this weekend. I made a decision to drop them on Sunday mornings because I figured that's quite a nice time to catch people. And yeah, it won't be long. They'll be sort of up to 10 minutes. So if that sounds like something that might be of interest, then just subscribe. As I said, it's the Mindful Leadership podcast. Yeah.
Brilliant. And Esther, Esther has told us something about research into resilience. I think you told us that. Can you tell us something about that?
About the
briefly?
children.
About the children.
Yeah. Okay. So poor old resilience is a word that gets bandied around in really unhelpful ways lately. And just before, it's weird, isn't it? Just before COVID really hit, we were all really fed up with it because it was really being used as a bit of a stick to beat people with, like if you're not resilient enough in this wildly broken system. So it's worth remembering that early research on resilience came out of research with children. So it was research that was undertaken in Hawaii, and all these kids were growing up in really difficult situations, and their parents very often had alcohol and substance abuse problems. And this gives you an idea of